everyone, it's Michaela Bensko with Veterans in Pain and VIP Vet Talk. Today we're going to be covering an article that I found really interesting, and it's going to tie pesticides to the infertility that a lot of our veterans are facing now, and also how the effect these pesticides can have on generations, actually not just the veteran, him or herself, but also it can go down generations deep, and why. And remember, so I do the reading, so you don't have to. Okay. Thanks for joining us today, and here we go. An article by Michael Skinner. So he's a professor of biology at Washington State University. And so he's published like 250 peer-reviewed articles. And this is something that was assigned reading. I am in the genomics actually, certification program at Stanford University. And so this is one of the articles that they had us read, and I found it really interesting and wanted to share it with you guys. So it has to do with a new kind of inheritance that you wouldn't expect, and it has to do with genetic inheritance. And it's not exactly what you think. So when it comes to genetic inheritance, you usually think, oh, I'm going to get blue eyes, or sometimes you have a recessive gene. Maybe I'm going to look like grandpa, or I hope I don't look like grandma, or something like that. So the front page of it is harmful chemicals, stress, and other influences that permanently alter which genes are turned on without changing any of the gene's code. Now it appears some of these epigenetic changes are passed down to and may cause disease in future generations. So what does epigenetic mean? Epigenetic means changes to your gene code because of the environment, because of outside influences. And so normally scientists thought that environmental changes to your genetic code were erased and were not passed down, but now they're finding that they are, and they can get passed down through several generations. And how far, we don't quite know yet, because this is relatively new information. What fascinates me about this is, that we do work with veterans, and so keep in mind toxic exposure to chemicals of any kind, and how that can affect our veterans' children down the road, not only the veterans themselves. So, and sometimes the individual that was exposed to the toxins may not be affected right away, but it can still be passed down for generations down the road. And our veterans, I'll never forget, one of our veterans showed me a photo, and it was of an individual in a hazmat suit, and they were on a tarmac, and they were spraying down dozens and dozens of uniforms. They were getting ready to deploy to Iraq, and they were spraying them down with DEET, or it was a pesticide, so that they wouldn't get bugs on them. But they were wearing these. So our veterans, our active duty personnel, were actually marinating in these pesticides and coming home with these horrendous, wounds that won't heal, and toxic exposure, service-borne conditions such as cancers. Here we go. So when my kids were born about 30 years ago, I knew they had inherited about half their DNA from me. At the time, the transfer of DNA from sperm or egg to an embryo was thought to be the only way that heritable information could flow from parents to children, at least in humans and other mammals. Of course, I understood that DNA is not destiny. Yes, many characteristics of a child may be written into his or her DNA, and specifically into protein-coding genes. But nurture matters too. Many of the contingencies of life, what we eat, what pollutants are in our environment, how often we are stressed, affect how the genes operate. So social and environmental influences are often invoked, for instance, to explain why identical twins can end up with different diseases despite having highly similar complements of genes. But we did not know back then that our biological bequest to our children includes more than just our DNA sequences, that indeed not just our kids, but our grandchildren and great-grandchildren might inherit what is known as epigenetic information. Like DNA, epigenetic information resides in our chromosomes. So chromosomes are what house the genes. It's kind of the scaffolding for our genes, and regulates cellular functions. But it is distinct from the DNA sequence and responds to the environment. It can take various forms, including small molecules that attach chemically to the DNA and to proteins in chromosomes. Research at my laboratory and others, mainly on rats and mice, has found that certain pollutants, including agricultural chemicals, jet fuel, and even some common plastics, can induce epigenetic modifications that cause disease and reproductive problems, all without changing the sequence of the animal's DNA. More startlingly, when such epimutations occur in the cells that give rise to eggs and sperm, they can apparently become fixed in place and then transmitted along with any resulting health risks to later generations. All right, so when we're talking active duty personnel and they're deployed, they are exposed most often to these things called burn pits. So if you haven't heard of burn pits, these are incineration pits. So they can be anything from a trash can next to the mess tent or next to their tent that garbage goes in, food goes in, plastic plates and utensils, and they burn it to incinerate it, to get rid of it, up to acres, dozens of acres wide and long fields that they throw everything in, from jet planes, jet fuel, body parts, rabid dogs. I've heard it all. Toxic chemicals, anything you name it, they put it in the burn pit fields. They burned it, and our men and women were manning these fields without hazmat suits and without masks, most of them. And nobody was warned about the fact that this could be dangerous or lead to issues once they got back home. So this article really, really struck me. So I would definitely do a good Google, and Michael K. Skinner is his name. And I love how he writes, because it's very easy, it's very palatable, the information. So he goes on, and the science in this area is evolving rapidly, and long-term studies in people now hint that epimutations may pass from generation to generation in humans as well. So given the many aspects of biology that we share with other mammals, it seems reasonable to expect that such epigenetic transgenerational inheritance does occur in people. Remember, so this is still kind of new, right? They've done the study on rats, so this is an assumption, but the logical resolution to it is that this could very well be in people as well. If so, the implications for public health could be profound. Some part of the increases in obesity, diabetics, and other fast-rising diseases amongst baby boomers and more recent generations might have originated with their parents' and grandparents' exposure to pollutants such as DDT and dioxin. So, the dark matter of the genome. So I don't know if you're getting bored yet. I find this totally fascinating, so just bear with me and hang in there. So epigenetic effects on cells. Here we go. Remember, epigenetics is the environmental effect on your DNA. So the epigenetic effect on cells have been recognized for some time, but the extent of their involvement has become clear only recently. So decades ago, biologists noticed that lots of places in mammalian DNA have a methyl radical attached to them. In humans, this epigenetic mark often occurs where a cytosine code letter precedes a guanine in the DNA sequence, which happens at about 28 million spots along the chromosomes. Scientists first thought that the main function of DNA methylation was to shut down transposons, dangerous stretches of DNA that could move themselves from their original positions into the chromosomes to other parts of the genome, sometimes in ways that cause disease. So we now know that methylation also helps regulate the activity of normal genes, and that it goes awry in many cancers and other disorders. So basically, as the great-great-grandpups matured of these mice that they did some studies on, the males suffered problems dissimilar to those of their distant ancestors, all from a fleeting dose of widely used agricultural chemicals. And the bottom line of this article is that it shows that the inheritance went down to about 4 generations and seemed to stop at about 4 generations. So, but then again, with the mice. So we don't know in humans so far. Then there's another thing called accidental inheritance. So my first glimpse of multi-generational epimutations was a product of serendipity. About 13 years ago, Andrea Cupp and I, with a few of our colleagues at Washington State University, were using rats to study the reproductive effects of 2 chemicals widely applied in farming. So another thing they talk about in research is that most of these aha moments or these new amazing discoveries, they happen by accident when they're actually looking for something else. So let's see, a few of our colleagues at Washington State University were using rats to study the reproductive effects of 2 chemicals widely applied in farming. The pesticides methoxychlor and the fungicide vinclozolene, vinclozolene. All right, so like many agricultural chemicals, they are endocrine disruptors. They interfere with the hormonal signals that help to direct the formation and operation of the reproductive system. So we had injected the chemicals into pregnant rats during the 2nd week of gestation, and when the embryo's gonads developed and saw that nearly all male offspring grew up to have abnormal testes and make weak sperm and too few of them. So now we're talking about infertility that they're finding in rats. And I can't tell you how many veterans come through our program that have fertility issues and are wondering if we can cover fertility issues for them. We were not thinking about epigenetics at the time, and it never occurred to us that these defects might be heritable. So we had no plan to breed the rats that had been exposed to methoxychlor or vinclozolene while in the womb. But one day, Cup came into my office to apologize. By mistake, she had mated unrelated male and female pups from that experiment. I told her to check the grandchildren of the exposed dams for defects, the females, although I did not expect she would find any. And to our amazement, more than 90% of the males in these litters showed the same testicular abnormalities as their fathers, even though their parents were just pinhead-sized fetuses when they and their grandmothers were briefly exposed. The result was surprising because many toxicology studies had looked for evidence that environmental chemicals such as vinclozolene, I'll never get that right, vinclozolene, had caused DNA mutations, but had found none. We confirmed ourselves that the frequency of genetic mutations was not elevated in the rats exposed to the agents. Moreover, classical genetics could not explain a new trait that appears with 90% frequency in different families. I knew, however, that the minuscule fetus contains primordial germ cells, which are progenitor cells that give rise to sperm or eggs. Most likely, I thought the chemicals had directly influenced those progenitor cells, And this effect simply persisted as the cells divided into sperm or eggs and eventually into grandchildren. If this were the case, then the brief chemical exposure caused by grandpup's testicular problems directly and future generations should be perfectly normal. There was one sure test to find out whether direct influence was to blame. We bred a 4th generation and then a 5th, and each time mating unrelated descendants of the original exposed rats to avoid diluting the trait. And as the great-grandchildren and later the great-great-grandchildren matured, the males of each generation suffered problems similar to those of their ancestors. All these changes stemmed from a fleeting but unnaturally high dose of agricultural chemicals that for decades were sprayed on fruits, vegetables, vineyards, and golf courses and active duty personnel. I put that in there for my effect. I was shocked by these results. Over several years, we repeated the experiments multiple times to confirm them and collect additional evidence. The most plausible explanation, and I underlined this, we concluded was that the exposure causes an epimutation that interferes with gonad development in male embryos. And this epimutation passes from sperm to the cells of a developing embryo, including to primordial germ cells, and so on for generations. In 2005, we published these results in Science, and that's a magazine, along with our epimutation hypothesis and tantalizing but preliminary supportive evidence that exposure to the fungicide had altered methylation at several important spots in the DNA of the descendant's sperm. You tell me that our vets aren't being exposed to unnecessary toxins that's affecting them generations and generations after they're gone. That's all I have to say today. I mean, I have a lot more to say, but that's all I have to say today. That's crazy. I just had to share that with you guys. So, yeah. So thank you for listening. And just soak that in for a minute, because I'm still soaking. I've already read that article, and just going over it again just kind of, just nails it home for me all over again. So, if you haven't heard of Burn Pits, please look it up. There's a wonderful organization. It's Burn Pits 360. So you can go and visit their website. If you think you've been exposed to burn pits, definitely register with their registry as well. And our organization is Veterans in Pain. That's veteransinpain.org. We facilitate cellular and alternative solutions for veterans suffering from chronic pain, and also spread awareness on the issues that they face on their journey towards healing. So have a good night, everyone, and thanks for joining me on this educational journey. So it's not the best news, but it is news and it's important. So everyone have a good night, and talk to you soon. Bye.